Ruth is the 8th book of the Bible. It comes after Judges and before 1 Samuel. The book is named after a Gentile woman. It's made up of 4 short chapters, 85 verses in all. Ruth lived in the time of the judges of Israel, a tumultuous period of time lasting just short of 3.5 centuries, longer than Australia as a modern country has been. It was a period of Israel's history following on after the Exodus out of Egypt. Moses and Joshua are long dead. It's a period of time that came before the time of the kings, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, Jeroboam, etc. The events recorded in this book occurred about 3,300 years ago. That's a while, isn't it? This ancient history has been preserved for us by the Holy Spirit. This account has us glimpsing into the personal lives of several ordinary people who lived at that time. Yet despite our apparent distance from them, geographically, generationally and culturally, the details of their life and the details of their story are relevant, relatable and applicable to each of us living today in the 21st century. Ruth teaches us the love side of redemption. Much of the Old Testament presents redemption in a more cold, clinical, matter-of-fact type fashion, very transactional through the Old Testament. Offer this sacrifice for this sin. Make this offering at this time of year. Bathe before attending temple. Be sprinkled by holy water. Attend these feasts on these specific days. By contrast, Ruth is a love story. In fact, Ruth is a story of love at first sight. Without Ruth, there is no Bethlehem story of Christmas. Forget it. Story's done. That's how important Ruth is. We're also given a practical demonstration of the role of the Goel. It's a fancy word, isn't it? The role of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. We're also taught about several other ancient Hebrew customs not observed in our modern culture, and we'll look into them as we go through. There's some weird things of shoes and all sorts of things happening. Let's read together from verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Israel at this time was unlike all the other nations. They all had kings. But God wanted Israel to be different from the nations, to stand out as unique, better. After all, Israel were the chosen people of God, the chosen special nation of God. So God gave them judges rather than kings. The judges were to lead Israel spiritually, morally, and militarily. It's a pretty important role, isn't it? All 3 of those critical roles. Plus, the judges were to oversee and render rulings on disputed matters of law. Sadly, Israel proved repeatedly that they were not better. They were no better than those surrounding nations. The fact that there was famine in Israel indicates the poor spiritual state of Israel at the time. It's almost certain this famine was a judgment of God upon a rebellious nation, upon a rebellious people. It's also ironic that a place called Bethlehem, literally the house of bread, where the bread of life will be born, has no bread to feed the people. The land previously described, who remembers how it was described by the spies that went in? That's it. The land flowing with milk and honey is now in deep and deadly famine. The sort of famine that forces families to migrate to new lands. We've got to go. There's nothing for our sheep to eat. There's nothing for us to eat. I've just completed a study in the book of Genesis. You know, there was 3 great famines in the book of Genesis. A famine that drove Abraham to Egypt. And I think when Abraham was in Egypt, he picked up a maidservant named Hagar. All sorts of catastrophe from that famine. Then there was the famine that drove Isaac to Philistia. And that famine endangered Isaac's marriage, almost destroyed his marriage. Then there was a famine that drove Jacob to Egypt, the most famous of all of the famines. What happened then? Israel went to Egypt and they remained there for 430 years. That's why they became a nation. Spent 400 long years in fulfillment of an earlier prophecy where they were slaves, oppressed by the Egyptians. How desperate this man of Judah must have been to go to the hated Gentile lands of Moab, a place Psalm 60 and Psalm 108 disparagingly describe as a washpot. No self-respecting Jew, no self-respecting Hebrew would live in Moab, that dirty bowl of water. Verse 2. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means God is king. Now that's interesting, given that Israel had no king at the time. God is king. The name of his wife was Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet. Beautiful name. The names of his 2 sons, these are shocking names. Mahlon, his name meant sickly. And his brother got it even worse. Kilion, his name, I couldn't imagine going to school if this was my name. His name meant puny. Hey, puny. Hey, sickly. That's what their names actually meant. They were Ephrathites. That's the family group they came from, meaning fruitful. Of Bethlehem, the house of bread, in the tribe of Judah. Who knows what Judah means?
Oh, praise, that's right.
Praise. Yeah, that's it. Praise. You got there. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech tragically dies. And she was left and her 2 sons. The meaning of these names is significant. Their names tell a story. And what you'll find when you look through the Old Testament, a lot of the names of the places and the people tell a story. It's a story behind the story. What we have in this story is God is my king from a fruitful family, leaving the house of bread and the land of praise to live in a dirty wash bowl. This prodigal family, prodigal is just a Bible word meaning wasteful. This wasteful or prodigal family choose to live outside the land of promise. And they suffer harsh correction from God. God cares about how we live. God cares about where we live. And it's important for us to ask ourselves the question, where am I living? Where am I living today? Not after a postcode. Where am I living? It's imperative for believers to do a little self-examination of our Christian walk. If we were more honest with ourselves, if we were tougher judging our own lives. You know, it's really easy to point the faults out in other people, isn't it? Look what they're doing. Look what they're doing. We should point our fingers on ourselves. Look at those things in our life that isn't right. If we were doing that more often, God wouldn't have to correct us. We wouldn't need the tough judging hand of God in our life. Are you spending your time walking in the will of God? Or are you living in a dirty wash bowl? How's your prayer life going? That's a good measure. Do you spend much time studying the Bible? That's another good barometer. How much time each week do you spend or do you set aside totally in service to God? When was the last time you shared the gospel with someone? That's a really critical barometer in your life. When was the last time you shared your faith? Are you living in godly fruitfulness or in worldly filthiness? And they're two pretty wide extremes. Perhaps you're living somewhere in the middle, a lukewarm, limbo land, vacillating between fruitfulness and that other end of the scale. You don't want to be in that lukewarm middle place. Devote your lives totally to Jesus. He's looking to pour out blessings in your life. I'm not a prosperity gospel preacher, may it never be. But God wants to bless you. And he can't do it when you're living in rebellion against him. You can't do it when you're in this limbo land in the middle. And blessings can come in many forms. Wonderful blessings from our wonderful God. Verse 4, now they, that is Mahlon and Chilion, took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, meaning fawn or deer. And the name of the other, Ruth, meaning friendship or compassion. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Do you think God is trying to catch Naomi's attention? Do you think God is trying to tell Naomi something? Her husband is dead. And now, to add to her tragedy, unimaginably, her 2 sons also die. A totally destroyed family. And let me just add in at this point, just because you've had a death in your family doesn't automatically mean God is judging you. Death is a part of our life, so don't condemn yourself if someone's died in your life. In this particular story, I wonder if these things are happening because Naomi is living outside that land of promise. But don't beat yourself up if bad things happen in your life. It doesn't mean God is judging you. Sometimes bad things just happen. But from her perspective, what she's thinking, I'm cursed. I'm under the judgment of God. For 10 years, Naomi dwelt in a dirty wash bowl outside the land of promise. And I think there's an important lesson for each of us, and especially for parents. Your actions have consequences for your children. Elimelech and Naomi look for greener pastures in pagan Moab. Everyone's always looking over, what's the neighbour got? What's that person down the street got? Their sons end up marrying Moabite brides because of their decision. A shameful and disobedient act to marry a Moabite. You weren't allowed to do it. Deuteronomy 23 verse 3 says, we're told specifically in Deuteronomy 23 that no Moabite or Moabite descendant to 10 generations, great, 10 generations, is even allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord. Incredible. Moabites were excluded from fellowship with Israel by law. Then she arose, verse 6, with the daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. It's only after the death of her husband and 2 sons that Naomi finally thinks of returning to the land of promise. Sadly, often Christians also refuse to listen to God until some tragedy strikes. Sometimes we will not hear from God. I know the Bible says such and such, but I just want to try things my way for a little bit longer. The obvious choice is the only thing we won't do. And it's only when we come to the end of the line, when the road ends, there's nowhere to go. It's only when we've exhausted all our energy, all other options, that we finally turn to God and give up our struggling. This is often how God works. He lets us fight and struggle, thrashing about, until we give up and surrender to his will. Maybe there's trouble and trauma bubbling away in your life. A troubled marriage, mental health issues, a lack of purpose, troubles with the family, a lack of drive. I just can't get out of bed and get moving. Have you ever considered maybe you've been dwelling in Moab? Don't wait for 10 years like Naomi. Determine in your heart today to come back to the house of bread, the house of praise, and the house of fruitfulness. The Lord is waiting for you to turn to him and grasp onto him. Verse 8, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. We see in these events the heart of this beautiful woman, Naomi, a godly woman who's suffered terrible loss. Her first thought is for the future of her 2 daughters-in-law. If she was selfish, she would have had them come back with her to look after her. We also see the heart of the daughters. Clearly, they have great love for Naomi. Verse 11, but Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. It's self-evident that we live in a very different culture to these women. In these ancient times, it was considered shameful, unthinkable, for a woman not to get married and have children. Unthinkable. We see in this narrative a reference to a strange Hebrew custom and law, one of several through this book. The custom said, if your husband died and you had no heir, the widow had the right to claim one of his brothers as her husband. We give this custom the Latin-derived designation, levirate marriage. just a fancy word, Latin word, levir, meaning husband's brother. I always thought it had something to do with the tribe of Levi, but it has nothing to do with that. Could you imagine living in that culture? I've got two brothers, and I didn't care who they married, but if I lived in that culture, I'd want to say, who you marrying who? What? What are you doing? No. Or what about brides? I'd imagine the brides would be looking up and down the list of the brother-in-laws. Maybe not. Maybe Joe isn't the perfect one. Maybe there's someone better. What about the position of best man? You're not just holding the ring anymore, are you? There's more on the line. Everyone would be thinking, do I really want to be best man in this wedding? Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Orpah seemingly does the intelligent thing and returns to her family. The one named the fawn or the deer skips back to the familiar. We're also told specifically that she returns to the worship of Moabite gods. Now, we don't know too much about Moabite gods, but one Moabite god we know about is Chemosh. Just to give you a glimpse, a flavour of Chemosh worship, human sacrifice was included in worshipping this god Chemosh. So that's the god she went back to. We never hear from Orpah again. She disappears into oblivion, making the rational choice, but finished. But Ruth clings to Naomi. And in this decision, she's also choosing the God of the Hebrews. She's holding tight and she won't let go. We each need to follow Ruth's example. Cling on to Jesus and never let go. The tougher things get, the tighter you cling. The worse the tragedy that strikes in your life, the closer you get. Get deeper into his word, get deeper into prayer. Cling to Jesus. Jesus Christ is mankind's only hope of salvation. Poor Orpah walked away from that. And this next section contains probably the most recognised verses in Ruth. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. In these two women, Orpah and Ruth, we see the distinction between genuine faith and faith short of salvation. Orpah, you read the text, Orpah said all the right things. Orpah cried genuine tears. Orpah appeared to love Naomi. She did love Naomi. She appeared to love Naomi's God, just as Ruth did. If you examine in verse 7, you'll see that Orpah sets out on her journey. She actually packs up and starts going to the land of promise, fully intending to arrive at this land. There are many people in churches all around the world. Hopefully no one here in this room, but there are many millions of people in churches all around the world, right this day, Sunday, sitting in pews all around the world. They say the right things. They act like believers. They pray like believers. They attend Bible studies like believers. They might even be pastors of churches, deacons of churches, secretaries, treasurers of churches. They walk like believers. They appear to be genuine people of faith. But when trouble, trials or tribulation comes, they depart from the faith. They walk away and go back into the world. Back to Moab. Back to the dirty wash bowl. Then we have Ruth and her great example. She's the real deal. Ruth does what most outside observers would say is the irrational thing. Ruth, can't you see? Naomi has no future, no family, no money, no earthly hope. I can almost hear some of my friends, what do you go to church for? What's the point of that? Ruth, Naomi's God has abandoned her. Her husband's dead. His 2 sons are dead. Your husband's dead. That's the God you want to follow? If you go to Israel, Ruth, you'll be ostracised due to your corrupted Moabite heritage. The Mosaic law excludes you, Ruth. No good Hebrew man will want to marry you. But Ruth has set her path on going to the land of promise. She's focused on the house of bread. She's focused on a fruitful people, on the tribe of praise. She steps out in faith, having come to a knowledge of the living God. She's now committed to following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She has no interest in returning to worship Chemosh and all the other false Moabite gods. No way. Whatever the hardships, she's committed herself to serving the Lord. Even if you didn't know how this story plays out, you know that God is going to do great things in the life of this woman. God is continually searching for men and women who are single-minded in their pursuit of his will. And this is why I previously challenged you to do some honest self-examination. Verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Naomi's been gone for about a decade. She'd assumed that she'd long since been forgotten. They're not going to remember me back in Bethlehem. Naomi was wrong. The entire region was excited at news of her return. I suspect strongly that Naomi lived up to her name. She was pleasant. She was sweet. Naomi was someone everyone loved, someone everyone wanted to be around. You wanted to be Naomi's friend. Did you hear? Naomi's back in town. Isn't it wonderful? The sleepy little town of Bethlehem was alive with excitement and joy at news of Naomi's return. Verse 20, but she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? Don't call me sweet, call me bitter." It's a play on words, revealing the fragile state of mind that Naomi was understandably in. Also notice that Naomi now says that she went out full. What? We just read the story, didn't we? They left 10 years earlier out of desperation. There's a great famine. They had nothing. They had to go or they'd die. It's only once she's lost everything that she realises how rich she'd been. Sometimes we can't appreciate the blessings we have till we lose them. Remember to give thanks to God every day for the blessings you have. The poorest person in this world, the poorest person in this room is greatly blessed. You have hundreds of things to give thanks for to God. You have hundreds of blessings in your life to give thanks to God for. Learn to fully appreciate the good things in your life that you have, that God's given you. Don't spend your time dwelling on the negative, depressing yourself with your minor first world problems. We're expert at that in the West, aren't we? Whinging about just trivial things that don't matter. Verse 22, saying Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. By using her name Naomi, don't miss that, the Holy Spirit just rejects her new name. You're sweet, not bitter. And I have great things planned for your future, Naomi. Don't sit with a black cloud over your head thinking, woe is me. God has great plans for your life. Naomi may have given up on her life, but God had bigger and better plans in store for Naomi. Consider also that Naomi almost certainly walked past the fields of her late husband. Parched and barren fields, sold in desperation 10 or so years earlier, now full of rich crops. The house of the house of bread, fruitful once again. I think this no doubt would have accentuated her heartbreak and sense of loss. Look at this beautiful land that we sold for virtually nothing in lean times. How foolish we were. And we'll pick up in chapter 2 next time I speak here. Until then, may God richly bless you all.